I was just going to use my booming voice, my outdoor voice. It's very good to see everyone here. We have some faces that we haven't seen for the last month, so welcome back. This is a big meeting, and I hope everybody had the opportunity to look through this deck. We have our quorum, correct? Missing anybody? And Bliss.
Good afternoon.
She's online. Good afternoon. Do we have anybody else online? Okay, but we do have our quorum, and I'm still getting myself settled in. Apologies. I guess we need someone to make a motion to allow Bliss to participate remotely. Okay, thank you. Here.
Here.
Bliss is online, so we'll take a vote here in a second. Bill Lights, Bernie LaFeast.
Here.
Hey, and Alex Zielinski. All right, and so yes, Ms. Jameson is online, and she said will only be here with us until 2:45. She has a conflict, but if you would like to let her participate remotely, you will have to take a vote on that.
All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Bliss may participate remotely until 2:45 when she has a conflict.
And
Thank
Bliss,
you.
If you would just let us know when you leave so we can mark that for the minutes, that would be great.
Will do.
Thank
you. Next, we have approval of the minutes of the last meeting. Would someone like to move that they be approved?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. And with that, we have a very big presentation today, really, really big. So that's why I was speed walking us through. So I think we should spend quality time with all of our visitors and get started.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Katrina and the project team. We do have a presentation based on what you all asked for at the last meeting. Hopefully we'll address all of the questions. One of our presenters will be online, so I just wanted to let you know, we talked about the audit tool, and I think sort of in logical step, we would normally think of that audit tool as one of the first steps. But because of a scheduling issue, Eben Bean, who will present the audit tool, is going to go at the end. So just FYI on that, and I'm just going to hand it over to Katrina and the project team.
So I'm not going to say too much now because Ginger's already mentioned Eben, so that'll be good. Just going to run through how today is going to break down. So after my very brief introduction, we're coming back to you today with some information you asked for from us. Michelle is going to run through some LID implementation examples, plus some incentives and an additional information as well as we've gone through the process. And then Jerry is going to review some ordinance recommendations. Those of you that were here last month, Jerry was presenting online. He is here in person today. So Jerry is, those of you online, you can't see him, but you will later, hopefully. And then as Ginger mentioned, Eben is going to follow up at the end of the presentation, going through the audit tool overview. So with that said, this is where we are in our grant phase. You know, we mentioned to you last time, this is a grant funded project. We have moved through April with obviously presenting to you all in April, and then doing some work towards an appendix and additional work on that LID implementation guidebook, and then taking some of the ordinance recommendations and discussing those with the green, grey and blue infrastructure TAC of the Regional Resilience Collaborative. So May, we are back with you to review some more information. And then we have a couple more steps to go through throughout May. And this grant wraps up. The actual end date for the grant and the expiration date on the grant is June the 30th. So we have a lot to do in the next few weeks. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Morrison with the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council, who's going to go through some of the LID examples with you.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon. I know last month when we were here, you were looking for some examples and I brought some in all different ways, some implementations, policies and codes, incentives, and even including parking incentives. So the first one I'm going to start with looking at different land uses and some of the implementations. There aren't a lot of pictures online, but I found some, and this is just outside of our region. Winter Haven's pretty progressive with the LID, GSI implementations, and they have a gray to green enhanced stormwater permit design manual where this was taken from, this project was taken from. And it captures all stormwater on site using integrated system roof gutter downspouts, infiltration basins, parking areas, graded to flow into grass swales, open areas, and trees. And they also reworked the compacted soil. So they were concerned with their rapid growth and the nutrient impairment of, they have a 52 chain of lake system. And so they started looking into low impact development implementations. They are looking that this project was done with FDEP. They came up with a couple of manuals, and they're promoting the treatment of stormwater as a resource. So not a nuisance to be quickly disposed of through pipes and ditches. Now this is outside of Florida, but it is something you may see. This is a True Value hardware store. And as you can see, they redeveloped 2 vacant buildings, parking lot, gravel and lawn with 26,000 square feet of impervious area. And they turned it into rain garden, 2 subsurface infiltration basins, and then they have the new store. And while they were working on it, they did it in stages such that they wouldn't compact the soil. And then this is a smaller example, but this is just a regular old office, pervious pavers, bioretention, and then some infiltration, and then a larger office with similar pervious pavers, bioretention islands, and area. I think initially they had pervious asphalt, and then later on that wasn't working well enough. They went and replaced that with the pavers. And these are both out of Nashville, Tennessee, which has a great website. They've got a map. You can click on all their implementation projects and see what they're doing. They also have an effort called Depave Nashville. They've got a lot of volunteer groups, which will go in, take something like a massive church parking lot, break it into pieces, reduce the size of the impervious surface, and then they have grants for things like native plants and putting in some low impact development features. And this is kind of a gem of of an implementation here. This was in Raleigh. It's a Whole Foods, and so knowing their philosophy, they're looking to their commitment to sustainability. And here, their gleaming example is that cistern outside of the store, and that is used for irrigation and toilets. They have rain chain, subsurface infiltration, bioswales, bioretention, underground detention chamber. So next, moving into some residential examples. This is, again, back here in Florida, just outside our region in Winter Haven. This is a multi-family 5-story complex. And again, they're filtering or capturing all the stormwater on site with integrated system, roof gutters, downspout, infiltration, basin ponds, grass bioswales, open areas, and trees. They have the parking underneath the building. And then the LID features are easily maintained and routinely maintained outside of that. This is also residential. It's an area where they had seen flooding. This is in the Tampa area. This project was a cost share project out of SwiftMud, which is the acronym for the Southwest Florida Water Management District. And this features amended soils, bioretention, gravel, pathway, and storage areas, native vegetations, and it's in a residential area. Then looking more into single-family homes, here, one of our UF team members is very active in working with the development on getting landscaping, irrigation, and fertilizer requirements and restrictions. And I'm looking to see a quote from Pierce Jones, who was with UF IFAS. He says anything that moves away from the applications of fertilizers and reclaimed water is moving away from the source of the water quality program. So if you can move away from fertilizers and reclaimed water, have something like these Florida-friendly landscapes. This is here in Sunbridge, Westland Park, and they have the landscape guide that the residents there will use. And then again, we've probably all heard of the villages. Again, Florida-friendly landscaping and something similar. Okay. Another example, which wasn't pictured, Pierce just told us about the other day, Ryan Homes in South Leesburg was having issues with water utilities not giving reclaimed water, and potable water couldn't be used for their irrigation. So Land Development Code, Water Management District preventing irrigation of new homes. He recommended the use of a soil amendment and Bahia, so landscapes that don't need irrigation or fertilizer. And that's happening in our region too. So now that's not it. This is moving into something more public. This is up in Escambia County. It is the largest green roof in Florida, 33,000 square feet on their county office complex. It's got biofiltration, native vegetation. I've seen many pictures of it. The vegetation has changed over time. They plant different things in there, and also energy savings. Another example up in our capital. I don't know if anybody's been to Cascades Park. It's absolutely gorgeous. I visited my daughter who was attending school up there. We walked the multi-use trails. We ate in the restaurants. It used to be a brownfield site and it had flash flooding issues. Now they have biofiltration, bioretention, rain garden, wetlands, and more recently, they are planning a 5-acre mixed-use live, work, play, stay destination that's adjacent to this Cascades Park up in Tallahassee. So the last couple have been projects which the public can see. They're beautiful, you know, and an example. And then right here in Volusia County, we have the Sandra Stetson Aquatic Center. This is a demonstration project, LID, GSI. It's got all sorts of things, biofiltration, rain garden, floating wetland, BMAT system, native vegetation. I don't know if any of you have seen that. So at one of our very recent council meetings, we focused on water. And all three water management districts that are within our 8-county region for East Central Florida were at the meeting, and there were presentations by St. John's as well as some from the council. But Tom Frick, who is with the St. Johns River Water Management District, gave a presentation, and I stole a couple of his slides just to remind you of their core missions, which include water quality and flood protection. Excellent. And also resilience priorities, flood protection again, and nature-based solutions. This picture is of another cost share funding project. You saw the one for El Prado with a different water management district. This is with St. John's. This used to be a golf course. It's now got some multi-use trails. And Tom did mention, they just released, I think, 30 plus projects that were cost share. They released the list of those the mid-April, so you can go check those out and see about maybe applying for some kind of public or pilot project that you would like here for Volusia County.
And then just to clarify, the council that you mentioned is the East Central Florida Regional Planning Councils.
Yeah, their council, yeah. That meeting was recorded, so if you would like to view a recording of it, I'm not sure if it's posted on our site, but you could email Katrina. I'll get you the link and you can watch it, and I can maybe figure out where the best, the water management district, and then Brenda, who is our planning manager, is looking, or planning director is looking into a one water project for the region, and gave a talk also. So some collaboration potential with the water management district, because that has come up in, I think, our conversations, is to remember that they permit by state law. So a local jurisdiction can have stricter regulations and is responsible for enforcing them. He did say they would love to provide technical assistance, and they welcome LID projects. So, and to consider the public pilot projects, such as the couple that I showed you, and to apply to them for cost share funding for those. And when you look for those, look for hotspots, whether it's poor water quality or flooding. If it's a little more impaired, it's probably more likely to get funded. So now moving into examples of policy and code, and this is taken right here from Volusia County's comp plan. You can see there are several elements that encourage and promote low impact development and green infrastructure. Yeah, these are all existing. Yeah, and then the conservation subdivisions. So Ormond Beach and Volusia County also has some in their comp plan as well. And you can see they have some policies from utilities, future land use, conservation, which encourage green infrastructure. Next slide. But in their conservation element, they actually have a goal of low impact development. And then they have objectives and policies related to that. So this sets it up for their land development code. And here, this is 2013. They have their LID design manual, and they also give incentives. So it is an incentivized approach to LID, but it's right here in Volusia County. And you can see some of the incentives there with fees being waived and expedited processes.
We have a community in Volusia that's actually adopted LID design manual 2013. They used an incentive approach, but I haven't seen any example of LID. Is there one? I would think if there was one, somebody would think. And therein lies an issue. Okay.
Remember to use your mic.
Well, now I'm done.
First.
No, I floated that to the principals of Zev Cohen and didn't get any response about, have we done it before? Did you know it was out there? So I don't know.
And I
Oh.
would say, I think part of the discussion we've had is that there are pieces of what is considered LID in a lot of projects. But is there a standout one that pulls together all of those elements into one with the standout, like the cistern, and the bioswales and all that at once is what's harder to find. But there are elements of LID in probably every project.
Yeah, I was going to counter my question with a lot of Ormond is within the Tomoka River Basin, which it has for a long period of time now had St. Johns River Water Management District nutrient removal requirements for all of the stormwater permits. So almost all of the projects are going to exceed what a wet pond can handle and have some other element of green stormwater infrastructure that is part of the development. So regardless of this, to meet the St. John's permitting requirements, a good chunk of Ormond projects have already been there.
On a park which they've gone designed for the city, that's all basically caught underneath the parking lot. It's all vaults with stormwater. And that was a reuse of an old hotel site for conversion into a public facility.
The Sheraton. Clay, I haven't been there in a while. Is there signage that promotes that on site at the park by any chance?
No, the biggest promotion they had is when the vault failed and the parking lot collapsed. That was a manufacturer defect, but it was quickly corrected. Unfortunately, it happened very quickly and no one was injured and everything else, but they do not necessarily have any educational signage or any kind of otherwise directing folks to understand that this was an LID project there.
And we won't bring that one up again. Thank you.
So finding pictures and detailed information on these projects is not easy. Recently the DEP through the Nature Conservancy released, I think it's been within the past year, photographs that can be used, and I used some of them. So it's a matter of sending them pictures, descriptions for all to see, and showing people, maybe through your newsletters, your social media, letting people know what's happening and what's actually there in things, that may seem kind of boring, like the commercial parking lot or, something like that. Just letting them know what actually is there. So some of the incentives. So that was an incentivized program, or is an incentivized program. In Apopka, they have density, additional height and lot coverage, and then parking reductions. In Orlando, rebates for Florida-friendly landscaping, irrigation, rain barrels, and again, reduce stormwater fees. These are just some incentives. Maybe not in an ordinance, some are in the land development code, other just through their water utilities. Titusville has a brand new LID ordinance incentivized. That was in November 2021. You can see some of the parking reductions and additional density that they have. They don't have any pictures yet, but I did talk with one of their planners, permitters, who said they've had one. It was a Culvers, has made it through their entire LID process, and they've got a Wawa online, and they have other applicants. They're interested because they're saving money with parking reductions. There were a couple other stormwater fee credits, St. Pete, Sebastian. Up in Tallahassee, there's a loan program, so residents can borrow money for things like rain barrels, rain gardens, permeable pavement, because I know you had thought also about, like, well, what if we require or incentivize for the larger projects, what can the existing single-family homes do? And so some of these incentives I'm showing you from various places around Florida. Tampa, fast track again for the permitting. And then in Alachua County, they also talk about technical assistance for LID practices. And I think Winter Haven also provides that. So here we have our example of a required LID for new buildings and redevelopment sites. This is in Doral, which is down there between Miami and the Everglades. And notice they also have maintenance required. And even though it's required, the incentive would be expedited permit reviews, again, reduced application fees. They also have a developer builder award recognition program, which either is a bonus or something to show off among builders and developers, but it's a way also to alert the residents what's going on, what's being awarded. So finally, I have some parking examples. And you can see in Apopka, there's an incentive for additional height, additional lot coverage, parking reduction. Groveland requires permeable parking lot and high aquifer recharge areas. And Winter Haven requires off-street parking lots to use LID techniques. And then again, we're back to Doral. They have minimization of total impervious areas. And you can see the various ways to do that there. So I've given you some examples, visuals of actual implementations, some comp plan policies, and even a goal. You saw a goal in Foreman Beach there with the conservation element. And then also some land development codes, some of the incentives that are being used. Again, it's a little more tricky than just having a requirement, but you were wondering about some incentives. And so what I'm going to do next is pass the mic over to Jerry, who's going to dive in a little deeper. Sure.
Before you go, would it be possible to go back to the Doral slide? One of the things that I saw, I'm sorry. I think it's this one. I noticed that there were structural and non-structural LID components, and what I am curious of is do you have examples of what they mean by that, or what the?
I'm guessing the non-structural, Jerry, would be the environmental site design, you know, like up front, the natural topography and maintaining the hydrology and those kind of things. That's one that I have to go back and read that.
Okay, I was just curious. It was anyway, stuck out.
I have some filters. I think it's very like. Structural makes sense to me. It's the design.
Structural makes sense to me because it's the design of your site, but non-structural, I'm wondering if these are policy implementation things. Are these rules the occupants have to follow or practices that have to be followed? That is where my mind was going with non-structural. So I was, but I'm not sure. I don't want to be leaving moves.
Non-structural bioswales and things that would involve construction, maybe some operation.
So we have a few different opinions, guesses on what that is. Also, even maintenance, you know, a lot of times requiring maintenance for the efficacy of the system years to come.
I have a question, just in general, relative to the, it's me over here.
I'm like,
Hey, where's it coming?
it didn't
I-
sound like it was coming.
Hello. I keep coming back to whether the incentives are adequate, right? I mean, are we biting around the edges, or are they really adequately enticing folks to do it? That's one question, and I'm not sure we can answer that. But second question I have is concerning the the cities themselves and whether they have an incentive to provide incentives. Because, you know, whether it's a grant or something from these various organizations, I find it curious. You mentioned these various cities. There's a whole lot of cities we're not mentioning. And so I was wondering if there was something with Ormond Beach, for instance, that drew them to that.
If
I-
I may,
yeah, I was
address
gonna-
that, I do know that in many cases, it was a response to crisis, that there were severe flooding issues that arose. And I mean, that's often what leads to change, right? Is some kind of crisis, like we've got to do something different here. And I mean, I don't know the specific examples here, but I know that that's the condition we're in Volusia County right now, because we've just come off of a major crisis and we're looking for a different way to do things. So I think there's that, but it's also that this is kind of the standard practice in the industry now, and I think we're just trying to get code to catch up.
Right. And from your standpoint, because you're plugged into it, do you think the incentives are adequate?
What do you mean?
Adequate to entice developers and whatnot to take them on?
Well, you're asking a question about incentives versus requirements.
That's
and
right. That's right.
Right. And so I don't think that incentives ever entice the developers to change their ways, because it's more expensive to get your designers to do things in a different way than they just normally plug and play. So no, I think that we have to move towards more requirements, the shalls versus the shoulds, to actually get change to happen.
I see. So you don't think the incentives are enticing?
In our, if I may, in our meeting last month, we were admonished that not to go the incentives route, but we didn't explore that. I don't really want to derail the presentation because there's so much for us to take in, but that is a question that I do feel we might like to pursue at the end of the presentation.
Right.
Why the admonishment? What's the experience been?
Right. Well, I was actually hoping to add something else, not a response to Jack, if I may. I really appreciate Michelle bringing these examples to the table. I think it helps to have more pictures of more examples of what we're talking about. What I see in all of these examples, and Michelle, Mo really did mention it, but didn't drive it home. And I'd really like to drive home the point, and maybe Jerry will do more of this, is we're really talking about disconnecting the impervious surface, having lots of places on a site where the impervious surface gets broken up by areas where recharge and infiltration can happen. And so again, we mentioned last time the language of treatment trains, having multiple steps along the way as stormwater moves across a site. There's lots of places where it can dip into the ground and be taken out of the flow. And so I'm hoping, Jerry, as you come on board here, that you will maybe explain some of those concepts further. Yes? Okay. Wonderful. Thank you.
And Bob had his, thank you.
Going to pass the mic to Jerry, and he's going to talk a little bit more about some ordinance recommendations, requirements versus incentives. You also, something to ponder while you're listening, as you talked about last time, what would be required, what might be incentivized, and if it's incentivized, is that only temporarily and then it becomes a requirement? And is it for the county and unincorporated areas? And what about incorporated areas?
Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you in person. Those of you who were here last month, I was indirect from Philadelphia. So good to start. No. There should be an overview slide.
Other what?
Yeah. Nope. Okay.
Next, go one more. There, that's his overview.
Okay, so this is not what I've got. So let's go forward with this. So we talked about a general overview last time and basically how an ordinance is laid out with the purpose and intent, applicability, et cetera. And we talked a little bit about environmental site design, and that's the process by which we get to implementation of the LID. The idea being that you start with the site as it exists, not with the development proposal you want to put there. And you see what the site is best suited for based on limiting the amount of change to the topography, drainage systems, the natural systems that are there. That's a whole 180 degrees from the way we've been developing Florida. But this ordinance draft is set out to do that. And the way that we've drafted the ordinance initially was to require LID and just a universal requirement for all new development, for major redevelopments, and an incentive program for existing single-family platted lots that might be wanting to do some redevelopment or are vacant currently. Those are kind of the opportunities there. And then there's also a requirement for a waiver because it doesn't always apply. Sometimes there's going to be a situation where it doesn't fit. So that slide didn't make it. And we didn't talk about channel protection and flow. And so this is an idea of protecting the integrity of existing channels. You know, we don't want to do what we've done in Florida so long. Kissimmee River, Cross Florida Barge Canal, you know, anywhere you look, we have engineered our nature irreparably in some cases, but generally as a failure for what we were trying to do. And at least in the case of the Cross Florida Barge Canal, we stopped. And so next slide. And then conveyance flow. We want to make sure that whatever we're doing in terms of developing the property doesn't speed up the water. And that's been another approach that we've used. Get the water off site as quickly as possible. And I think that as we see the rule for ERP coming out, that the off-site flow is going to have to be less than or equal to the on-site flow. And again, that's not pushing the water away and getting it away as far as possible. It's trying to hold it, let it infiltrate as much as it can. Flood protection. Well, that's something we've seen recently just about everywhere in Florida, at least in the last couple of years. You know, who thought Orlando would flood twice? But it happens, you know. So the idea of all of these things that are going to improve water quality by slowing down the flow also are flood protective measures, because again, that water's not going off site to the lowest possible areas as fast as possible. It's being, to the most part, contained on the site. Now, we have extreme weather events, and I don't know that we're going to be designing for them ever. You know, a disaster is a disaster. That's just the way it goes. But we definitely have to, I think of higher standards in terms of not just the 100-year event, but more extreme events, because they're just more and more often. And then you wanted to look at where this should be implemented. And I think that definitely in high density residential and non-residential development and redevelopment, larger parcels of property, those should definitely be addressed. Again, I think that it's not a good plan to require it of single family lots that have already been platted based on design from the old way of doing things, engineering from the old way of doing things. You know, that's hard to retrofit. Incentives might be possible there. And if you're looking at a single family homeowner, you know, a rain barrel is a good incentive. And in Fort Myers Beach years ago, we provided them for free for the longest time, because Fort Myers Beach is a narrow spit of land like your barrier islands here. And, you know, if you can keep the water out of the system for a while, you know, it's utilizable in terms of drought periods, which they have, and it keeps the water from taking all of the nutrients into the system.
Sarah Lee has her hand up.
Could you tell me how you define high density residential in this particular slide?
Yeah, it'd be a subdivision or a multifamily development.
But when I think high density, I mean, I'm really wondering what kind of units per acre you mean. Because if you say single family residential is included in high density, would that be yes? Because I don't, in Volusia, I don't consider that high density.
Right, I understand, and I'm looking at it in terms of greenfield development. So you've
Okay.
got no density
Cool.
and you're increasing the density.
Okay.
So the subdivision should be designed to, excuse me, to utilize the natural contours of the land and the natural hydrology.
Okay.
But that would also be multifamily buildings. And I would imagine, you could, and again, a lot of these criteria, the thresholds, those are policy decisions for folks like you who have the experience locally to advise and ultimately for the elected officials to decide. What are those thresholds? Well, I don't know off the top of my head. There's not one magic bullet for every community in Florida or even the United States. And so you look at projects that apply to over 10,000 square feet, that might be a threshold. Okay. So land uses with high pollutant loads. You talked about what do we do with industrial properties? Well, industrial properties are often have the potential anyway for high pollution loads. The other thing that we're discovering is that properties that are irrigated with reuse water have like 4 times the nitrogen that's recommended for Florida-friendly landscapes. So reuse water, projects that are going to utilize reuse water, those would be a high pollutant load. And so that reuse water needs to be managed on site before it goes off site. Something to think about in terms of reuse water. Then if you've got areas where there's loading of hazardous substances, that's a whole nother level of mitigation, particularly in the event of a catastrophe, or at least disaster. And so implementation is key. We've got to make sure that there are criteria that can be followed. And that's why I'm a big believer in requirements. And we'll talk about incentives a little later. We want to incentivize retrofits or require them depending on the size of the project. If we're doing a project that's basically clearing off every development that was there, we would like to look at retrofitting that. The problem there is that the natural contours have probably already been disturbed. Flatten it. Flat's good in Florida, right? High, dry, and flat. But it doesn't work for water management purposes in terms of water quality and water quantity. So there may be needs for recontouring and restoring the natural topography, and that may be opportunities for amenities that don't exist currently. And then, of course, waiver. There's always an instance where something doesn't fit, or an instance where the property is of an abnormal configuration. And again, in urban areas that are already developed where you have stormwater management in place that's treating that quality issue and containing that quantity issue, then you may be in a situation where a waiver would be appropriate. So in your land planning regulations, there are currently 4 divisions. There's definitions and interpretation that would need to be revised. Zoning, potentially some revisions there, at least to empower the use of LID. Land development regulations is probably where the majority of these requirements would end up. And then you have overlay zones, which may or may not have to have more stringent requirements. If you have overlay zones that are near water, some of the rural areas that you have that are developed, but they have just like one little canal and, some platted lots, they may need to have higher requirements. Where you have urban areas, again, like I spoke of, you've already got an impervious situation, you've already got a treatment system. It may not be an LID treatment system, but it's in place and it's paid for, or paying for itself. So those may be either more stringent requirements or less. And so, again, the definitions and interpretations, we need new definitions, the necessary language to assure that the requirements are understood. In zoning, you want to look for conflicts. There probably won't be a lot there. And then the land development regulations, these are the major areas where things are going to be touched upon. And you had talked about doing this audit, the cast that Evan's going to talk about a little bit later. These would be the areas that I would believed to be places where you would look first. There may be other areas, everybody's code is different, but there may be other areas, but this is a good place to start in terms of approaching that cast. And more. And these are some of your overlay zones, which may or may not be areas that are important to address with either requirements that are higher or incentives where it really can't be done because the area is too urban and too impervious already. So these are the sections that have your purpose and objectives. Then there's your stormwater permit review. All of section 72 is probably where what's existing now is what you're working off of, or reference to manuals that you're using. And this is the area that we would probably suggest for the new requirements after you've done the cast and understand where things need to go and which ones you want to take. You know, you have some high level recommendations, I think, to make to the board. First is, you know, do we do this or not? And my recommendation would be, yeah, you do it, because this is the way things are going. You know, there's too many people, not enough land, and we have water everywhere, but none to drink. And then if you're going to do it, then it's, well, do we require it in certain places? Do we require it everywhere? Do we require it in some places and incentivize it in other places? Those are the kind of recommendations you want to make. Incentives sound really good, but often the cost benefit analysis doesn't work out, and so they aren't availed to. So an incentive program is pretty important in terms of its design. Right through that. So these are some ways that environmental site design can be incorporated. The first is road design. I mean, this is the major opportunity to access property. It's the big access points. And so if we're designing our roads to fit the contours of the property, that's great. If we're not, then we're upsetting the natural hydrological system, the natural topography. Next slide. Then next we go to how you access the individual sites or the individual parcels, and those are the driveways. And then how the lots themselves are laid out. I'm trying to look at some of the older plats, and you know, the idea for much of our time, maybe even still now, was to squeeze as many lots in there as possible. That's how cul-de-sacs got developed. You know, we lost a lot of connectivity in trying to just maximize the number of parcels that we could sell. And the more parcels you sell, the more you can recapture your development costs. Well, we need to be less greedy, I think, and a little more sensitive to the land and what the land requires. Because in the long run, we're just cutting off our nose to spite our face. We can take a better approach and do a better job. Excellent. Yes, sir.
So you suggest we take a look at the lands and reconsider how dense we actually put units in.
And what you may develop on that land.
What you may develop, but don't we already have that in place with the comprehensive land use plan?
I would say you do at a very high level, but not at a level that looks at stormwater treatment in terms of each site.
Right.
Are you really speaking to density of impervious coverage and not so much density of units per acre?
Yeah. It's the density of development. You know, if you take a 10-acre parcel and you pave it completely, okay, that's a dense occupation of that site in terms of stormwater. If you take a 10-acre parcel and, you know, 1/4 of it is used for a high-rise building, then you have the whole 3/4 of it to do site design.
I counter, if I pave the 10 acres and put vault storage underneath it, that I could greatly decrease the stormwater impact of that site and account for my neighbor's sites. And it's still probably not a good thing, but it meets the green stormwater infrastructure definition.
As long as it doesn't collapse.
I mean, that's just a poor product.
It could be a number of different things. In that instance, it was apparently poor product. It can be poor design too.
So I just still want some clarification because it seems to me we did this comprehensive land use plan and we put out densities. Every parcel out here has so many units per acre and, or so many units per X amount of acres. Isn't that kind of like the basis of where you start? I know when you want to come in and develop, you've got to change that comprehensive land use plan, or you have to make amendments to it to make that happen.
Or develop the way the comprehensive plan is currently laid out.
Correct. And to my point is that maybe we should consider looking at those densities as they exist versus creating more densities with special exceptions. Just a thought.
Is that?
That was a good question because I think we need to understand this. And I'm kind of thinking as a continuum as we learn more. So in the comp plan now, we have the densities, so many units per acre, right?
Yes, we do. We also have in the comp plan, or at least land development regulations, maximum lot coverage. So, you know, and I think somebody helped me here, maximum lot coverage in the LDLs is like 35% or 45%.
But
I'm just trying I'm trying to understand, you know, I think you use the word density a little differently than I do as a developer. I'm thinking units per acre.
Sure, I understand.
You're actually, from what I understand, saying, no, this is the percentage of the site that's being made impervious.
Impacted.
yeah, and I think it's important
So-
for us to wrap our arms around that distinction as we,
Yeah.
especially those
so-
of us who aren't in the business.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm thinking our starting point here is the zoning of the overall management, the fact that we have these future land uses which designate a maximum density per acre. And on top of that, a maximum coverage per acre. So we're probably starting somewhere around, I don't know, if I had to guess, I'd say based on those regulations, I'm probably starting with 40% of my property not being disturbed or made impervious.
Not being made impervious, but more than likely being disturbed. And then
Well,
it's,
15% of it, you know, well, never mind. Go ahead, yeah.
it's
I was
numbers.
making that point.
Then it's important what you do with the rest of it.
Sure.
And that's in terms of, you know, well, first of all, how you got there. Did you build with the contours of the property, or did you scrape it down to put as many units in as possible? What you do with the rest of the site is very important. And that's the landscaping. So the idea of moving toward native plants, which we're going to have to do because we don't have any water. And native plants can get by without water, much better than all the stuff that we tend to put in the landscape or have traditionally.
Yeah, you and I agree on that wholeheartedly. I would have banned several different types of sod decades ago.
And so, you know, I probably misspoke in terms of density. It's probably not the right word. The word probably should be impacts. And we want to put as few impacts on the natural hydrology and the ability to manage the stormwater as possible. And that has to start back at the subdivision site design when we have the clean slate of the land, or in a redevelopment situation when we are going to have the clean slate of the land. And what are the opportunities then to utilize LID as a way of contouring a flat property to be more supportive of an amenitized program? You know, flat in Florida, we have lots of flat. In Volusia, you're kind of lucky. You've got a ridge and some rolling hills and a little topography, you know. But you want to use that topography to your advantage, not scrape the hill down to where it's flat and take the other stuff out and use it for fill, but actually work with the property that's there.
A few meetings ago, we talked about clustering density to leave more land in conservation, and this takes it, I think, just little bit farther in terms.
It's kind of the flip side, you know, our approach has been, you know, okay, what am I zoned? How many units can I build? And how can I maximize my efficiency and minimize my costs and increase my profits?
I'm hearing in agreement with what you're saying, the opposite, that this is saying that clustering development, reducing the lot size and creating all of this chunk of impervious that doesn't have infiltration opportunities that are natural is what we like. Yes, you're conserving the other parts of the land, but you're not actually getting your increased runoff necessarily into those other parts.
And that's a design situation, you know, where do we put the cluster development?
Right.
And how is the water flowing naturally? And so, okay, this is the best place, we'll put it here. And the rest of the area we use to treat whatever that increased runoff is from the development.
I mean, most of the things that I saw on the last slide talked about things that aren't possible if you have a 5-foot side setback on a house and you have 10 feet between buildings and the runoff from the roofs is landing in a 6-foot area of ground and it's been compacted. I mean, reasonably speaking, there's no creativity that I can come up with other than decreasing the coverage. Which is effectively decreasing the impervious coverage of the site. What we're talking about is less impervious density, and cluster development within the developed area doesn't achieve that. And so I'm in my mind, that conflict is what I'm.
So it's a design with nature approach. And then an engineering with nature. You take the design and you make sure that as it's engineered, water in is equal to or less than the water out in terms of quantity and quality.
With traditional stormwater treatment techniques like ponds.
No.
Well, I'm asking as the engineer.
This
You're
is
saying
not,
that the engineer does this. and
LID is not traditional.
Okay, so traditional to me is a dry retention area that exfiltrates water into the ground. That's a traditional approach to dealing with stormwater. LID is finding opportunities for exfiltration into the ground. We have to show flood resilience. So we have to show that when we get 12 inches of rainfall on a site, say we have 75% in coverage, in impervious coverage within the clustered lot development area, which is realistic to what you get when you have a 7,000 square foot lot, build a house, a driveway, sidewalk, everything else. Where is my stormwater infrastructure within that area unless I'm decreasing my impervious coverage within that area?
So if you're doing a cluster development, you're clustering to save another part of the site.
And so how do I use that other part of the site as part of my stormwater infrastructure? I'm prohibited from using it as part of my stormwater infrastructure. I can't touch it. So that's where I'm stuck.
Why would that be?
Because if it's being conserved, I'm not allowed to touch it and my water is assumed dirty on initial discharge. And if I discharge dirty water to that protected environment, it is considered damaging of that environment because I haven't pre-treated my water. I have to flow it through a stormwater system first to meet the FDEP requirements in the state.
And so you don't conserve or put conservation easement over the remainder of the site. You use the remainder of the site for the GSI and the LID.
The traditional code approaches that I think we've seen locally have been to increase the conservation requirements, which have specifically blocked us from doing what you're saying. I mean, I'm stuck in the pinch between good ideas and good ideas and good intents and good intents.
This is untouched. And maybe that's a barrier, right? Maybe this is natural, but there's some ability to use it for.
And we also, I'm not,
Yeah, 2 of them going at once. I'm not feedback. My electric guitar moment. Okay.
One of the things that we have talked about within this committee and outside this committee is identifying the ordinances that are contrary to these principles. So I think you heard Tyler when I said cluster the development, so you can also cluster the nature, you need more nature. You're thinking immediately of that being a conservation property. It's just you don't have to get it a conservation designation. It's how you are deciding to use that property in the most natural way possible to allow nature to work for you and build the number of units that you wish to build on that property. That fair?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily, again, every site is unique. And so if you've got wetlands, they may want to be conserved, but if you've got a bunch of rolling hills, 200 acres, and there's maybe a couple wetlands here and there, you can cluster the development that would be entitled on those 200 acres into a smaller area and use the remainder for stormwater treatment, LID, as an amenity to the cluster of development. You build your own park.
Those types of things almost always in our area require a planned unit development or planned development plan. Our minimum lot sizes for those cluster developments are 4,000 or 5,000 square foot type of range. What we're dealing with in most of our other zoning in the county is 10,000 square foot or larger for most of our platted areas. And so within reason, an engineer isn't the person that is writing the rezonings. That's there are other components of that team. So when it is said that I could cluster a development, he can't alone. He can direct his team to as a developer. I can't as an engineer control what the zoning says. And in most of our rezonings, that additional area, in order to get the density bonus to reduce the lot sizes and have a prevention, instead of saying you can't exceed 100 units, it has typically required that that area be set in conservation. So that is definitely a barrier that we probably need to provide some guidance on how to avoid, because I see it as being one that can be overcome, but I see it as one that, and I may be taking this a little bit personally, but it's often blamed on the engineer or the developer when it's something that it involves a lot more people than just us. And I want to make sure that, through this, the questions I'm asking are, what are the tools? I'm familiar with all of the different stormwater techniques that we can permit with St. John's. I'm not going to be familiar with something that I can't get permitted. And I also don't, as the engineer that's having to work in the trenches every day, I don't have time to necessarily advocate for every new emerging technology or technique. So those are some of the things that, if I'm asking the questions and I'm seeming like I'm challenging you, it's
No, not at all.
Me just thinking through the future of how do we navigate this and what are the things that we're going to run into as unintended consequences.
And there may be unintended consequences. That's the case with any type of regulatory scheme. You can't think of everything. I mean, I can't. I try, but there's always something that you didn't expect. And that's why you have a waiver, and that's why you re-examine your program, and see what's not working. I think what you've been talking about over the course of the last 2 meetings that I've been involved with is, utilizing this audit tool that you're going to hear about to go over your land development regulations and see where they don't work with this type of program. And, there probably needs to be an opportunity in various zoning districts that you know better than I do, and as you identify them, or various future land use areas, that, okay, if you do LID and GSI for the development site, we'll allow you to cluster the development where you would normally have to have 10,000 square foot lots. And that may not be appropriate everywhere. You may have areas of stability where the 10,000 square foot lot is the norm. And to disrupt that would be, World War III. The green t-shirts come out, or the yellow or whatever, and it's we don't want this. But Volusia County has a whole lot of undeveloped land and a whole lot of wetlands. And so you have an opportunity in utilizing LID and GSI and the new stormwater rule, if it stands to way it's appearing to roll out, to start designing a little bit differently out in those suburban areas.
Yeah, I think that part of the discussion I was coming in, when you look at LID and as the one who writes the plan developments, that is where you see it the most, right? So in Ormond Beach, which has been a highlight of today, one of their requirements for planned business development is that you give certain public benefits. One of them is directing all of your runoff into a rain collection system for irrigation. Now, I think that's a great system, but we're going to get some pushback from local governments who have to find a place to put their reuse based on the new state law, which is why they're requiring it across all developments lately, instead of typical collection and redistribution systems. But I think that the challenge is that the ideal world, and I'm saying this from a member of this committee, someone who lives here, someone who works in the development community, is creating a code that at its core doesn't take extra process, right? That staff can administer. There are clear standards. I think that some of the concern is that to the extent feasible, or should try to implement this, or if you do this, you get this benefit. That implies a level of review similar to a special exception or conditional use where you're going to another step. And it may be that the benefit outweighs the extra time needed to go through that. But I think that at our core, we should be looking at baseline standards that just apply to the baseline residential zoning district.
Okay. I'm for that. But there was a lot of discussion about incentives, and so we want to make sure that we cover incentives. Let's move on. And again, this is just all section 22, the way things exist now, the area that you'll focus on. So I have some other slides. Yes. All right, so, oh, good. It's a question.
Yeah, on the incentives, just what we saw a little bit earlier on the different cities and counties, it appeared that Titusville, from the presentation that Mo gave, was really getting a lot of interest because of their incentives. And I just wanted, as we move into this, I'd love to have a lot more information about that. Because I'm a firm believer that if the incentives are significant, that you're going to get, a lot of people going after them. It makes good sense as a developer that's trying to do the right thing. If it doesn't end up costing me, way more to do that because I get trade-offs. And again, I'd love to hear more about the different areas, the incentives they used, and what was effective and what wasn't. But by the list in the presentation, Titusville was doing things like setbacks. They were doing things like density bonuses, parking reduction. I mean, really serious stuff.
And that kind of stuff works very well in a community like Titusville because they're barrier island, they're built out, they have, they're constrained already.
I grew up in Florida. Titusville isn't on a barrier island. The Cape is on the barrier.
Coastal.
They're on the west side of the river.
And they're coastal and they're, well, if you want to call the river a river, but it's salty. It's a salty river. And so to me, it's coastal, and the coastal areas are much more built out. So you have much more constraints, and that's why a setback incentive can go a lot farther there, because you can really do a wah-wah if, you can get a little break on the parking and those types of things. But when you're looking at the larger county and greenfield development, it's not so much of an incentive.
And Ginger wants to say something.
The matrix that Titusville uses that kind of shows their incentives, and when Jerry's done, if you want, we can pull that up on the web and look at that as part of the discussion.
They've done a really good job with regard to incentives. And I think because they have the constraints, they can make those incentives work on their behalf. And I think that's the case with most of the coastal and barrier island areas in Florida that are developed. Those that aren't developed are probably conserved. So talk about incentives, and I'm sorry that you didn't get these slides, but there's a 10-step program that's generally considered the best way to look at incentives. The first step is determine your objectives. So our objectives here are to improve water quality, decrease water runoff. And so then you have to analyze your audience to see what incentives are going to work for them. So again, the example of Titusville compared to unincorporated Volusia County. There's going to be different incentives for different developers and different products. And then you have to do fact finding and involve the audience. ENRAC would be a good audience to involve in deciding what incentives work. And you might want to do broader outreach to a larger development community to see, what can we do to make you do this? So already we're 3 steps in. Then you have to create the rules and the structure and develop a budget. Because with incentives, there's something being given for what is being done. And that costs money and it takes time. That's that kind of back and forth that we have in terms of staff time and, guidance. And you have to select the awards. What are the incentives going to be? What's going to appeal? And does our budget to do that match it? That's the kind of what of incentives. Then the sixth step is to communicate the program. That's the outreach. We're going to do this, and this is what we're doing. And, on and on. The point that was made earlier about interpretation at an LID site, here's what we're doing. And this is why, my recommendation would be that if nothing else, the county requires themselves to do this on all of their projects moving forward. Because then they're setting an example, and then you've got a demonstration, and, people can see what's going on. The county is, leading by example. And then probably the next step would be to, if you decide as a county to exercise your charter county powers, to require the municipalities to do it. And here's what we've done, and here's how we did it. Here's the kind of rules and regulations and standards and techniques and the manual for guidance. We've done the groundwork for you. Now you have to modify that to fit your circumstance. And then the operations, the unintended consequences. You want to track your results. And is it working? Are people taking advantage of the incentives? We have a conservation subdivision program. How's that working for us? It's got to work or it's not going to work. And the whole idea, again, is the water quality and water quantity, the flooding and the potable water need for our water quality to be better. So to make it potable takes a whole lot less effort. And then you have to fulfill the awards. Whatever the incentives are, you got to give them out. And you need to do that as quickly as possible so that things move forward, the process doesn't drag down. Then you evaluate it and measure it. Are we accomplishing our objectives? And then if you are, you celebrate success. The award program that what Darrell was talking about, I think, have a dinner, everybody likes a pat on the back, and it doesn't hurt if it comes with a steak or a nice vegan dish, but you need to get the community understanding that this is what we're doing now. And that then helps to build the market, which, none of it's going to work if there's no market. If we consider ourselves a growth state, which we have to because we are. 1,000 people a day still move into Florida, and some of them are buying homes, At least that's why we're developing property for homes, because there's a market. And that's all I've got, and I'm happy to answer any questions I haven't answered already.
While we have you, I just want to ask questions on, we talk about the barriers to LID, right? The trip ups. And I think in the examples that we saw today, I just jotted down as someone who gets stuck on the code side of thing, what revisions would be suggested, or what have you seen to battle certain things like the below structure parking that was used to limit impervious? We've tried that in certain cases. What we've heard back from local governments are, one, it exceeds the maximum building height because they don't contemplate that structure. Two, the parking areas have to be a certain level above grade, so it really ruins working with the natural topography. Or even, where are you putting your vehicular use area landscaping when it's under a building podium, are always very fun. Another we've seen, when you look at the bioswales and the treatment trains, there's this perception, and we've talked about it a little bit as this committee, on having a thick buffer around the perimeter of our property. That might not be the best place to have it, right? And in some local governments, you have to have a 5-foot buffer directly adjacent to your building, where what I've heard today and what I'd like to confirm is that sometimes it's better for that runoff to travel a bit, get treated, travel a bit, get stored, which is not landscaping right against the building. And so all of those little code provisions that we get stuck on when trying to implement innovative things are what I'm trying to wrap my head around, and how we change that. Because if we do it through a PD, they say, you're asking to change the whole book, just follow the rules. And that's where we end.
Well, PD is a two-edged sword, we'll use it when we need it. And if we don't need it, we'd like to do something without having to do that. If we can avoid the public hearing process and the green shirts and the yellow shirts, and, we'd like to do it that way, but we can't always make the money work. In terms of height regulations, Florida's got to take an overarching look at its height regulations. I mean, we're only going to get wetter And as we get wetter, we're going to have to go higher. And as we go higher, we're going to compress the envelope and all of a sudden we can't build or we need to think about additional height. And that's again where what I call, stable development, large, the kind of development that if you built out Cape Coral, it's platted, that you're not going to change that. You have to take big chunks of it and do a plan development to modify what's going on. You have to be able to acquire big chunks of it. And some of that you can do Cape Coral's building out pretty quickly actually, but in the northern areas, there's still a little wild, wild west. So there's opportunities for lot assembly. But, the point of the cast, and I'm making sure we're on time because I've been had time. The point of the cast is to go through your land development code and identify where you're not supporting LID. And then say, okay, well, height's sacred, it's in the charter for some of these smaller communities, so we're not going to mess with that. Okay, so that's a constraint. So what else do we do, well, we don't get nearly as much density on the property, particularly as we're elevating to meet flood requirements and freeboard and all of the other things that imply water. And, sometimes in those areas, a lot's just too small to do what your dreams are. You just have to accept those limitations. And that's, again, looking at the greenfield development, accept the limitations of the land. You can't build 10 warehouses out here because that requires such a disturbance that you're going to plow through the soil layers. We're going to release the nitrogen and phosphorus that already exist in Florida soils in a way that we wouldn't be doing if we went ahead and designed with the contours of the land. So that's kind of the nutshell for that. I think you do the cast, you take the template ordinance that we're developing with y'all for the grant for DEP and see where it can work and where it can't. It's not everything. It's very much a design approach. And so you've got this toolkit of different techniques that you can use that are LID or GSI, and you've got this piece of property. And here's what's happening on it now. Here's where the water's flowing. Here's what the quality is. Okay, how do we maintain that? And then you design what fits on the property. I think what you're going to see if this moves forward, and it may take hits and starts and 2 steps forward, 1 step back, whatever. I think that you're going to see that property developers will take this toolkit, look at the property, and if they can't do what they want to do, then they'll move on. Somebody else will have to do something else on that property. Finding a suitable property for the project involves doing the analysis for the GSI on the front end to see, will this work? Can we meet the requirements of the water management district, of the DEP, and of the local government? Make everybody happy, and if we can't, we walk away. That's a business plan model decision.
Thank you. Any other questions? And if not, I was thinking,
Alex.
sorry, Alex.
So Jerry, as a CFM, can you inform the group here how requiring or the county requiring an ordinance that, or not requiring an ordinance, adopting an ordinance that requires LID and GSI fits into the CRS program, and how everybody in the entire county can benefit from insurance discounts that way?
So there are points assignable to implementing LID as part of stormwater management, and those points help the CRS program. CRS program, if you're not familiar with it, is based on points. And the Insurance Service Organization, or ISO, they will look at what you've done and you provide documentation. And if the documentation fits what the CRS program requires, the 700 pages of CRS program now, you get points for that. And those points help to lower your rating. So the CRS program is a 10-point rating. It goes, you start in the program with nothing. You just have satisfied the national flood insurance requirements and you get flood insurance for your folks that live there. Then if you go to higher standards, more outreach, more information, more education, but particularly higher standards, then you get the points. And the point scales, for every certain amount of points, you reach a different classification. And for every classification, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 1, you get a 5% reduction in flood insurance rates for the entire community.
So as a follow-up question, as it's written right now, as far as where your model ordinances that you're passing over for this grant are, as it's written right now, how compliant is that with the CRS manual?
That would be compliant and it would result in 25 points.
Okay, thank you.
But that's an ordinance that requires LID. It doesn't incentivize it. It's required.
CRS programs, we are involved with it. We have a rating of 5. We actually have enough points for a 4, but program wise, we're missing the basic management plan that is required. And so we're working through that. So we do expect to see that increase to a 4. So as Jerry referenced right now, those in the unincorporated area, again, this is only pertaining to the unincorporated area, getting a 25% discount because we are in 5.
And that discount has been increasingly important as the Congress and FEMA are changing insurance requirements. Insurance is going up, up, up.
Is this just flood insurance or is this?
Flood insurance,
Just flood.
Na-
So it
nas-
only applies in the flood.
National Flood Insurance Program policies.
The way that the new rate program is set up, determination of what you pay or whether or not is not solely based on floodplain. It's now being tied to proximity to coastal resources, riverine resources, potential for flooding during storm events, et cetera. So what you're seeing is with the new rate 2.0 that they call out, more people will be required to have flood insurance, and the flood insurance rates are increasing.
Thank you. Clay, I'm sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Right now, house primarily public works, we have all of the components in that we have individual drainage basin plans and programs. It's pulling it all together to meet the very specific methods that you have to hit for CRS. We have basically all the information. It's just finding the time to pull it together in the format that they want. Yeah.
When you mention lack of BMAP, are you talking about, person? Okay, okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're moving on.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Anybody
Okay,
like a short break? 5 minutes?
okay.
Thank you.
on the tree. That's last month. So, leader or even if you want.
This is something that we asked to see at our last meeting. And because some of us found it to be very interesting in the LID workshop back in February as something that might accelerate our effectiveness.
Right. So we're going to introduce Dr. Eben Bean with the University of Florida, who developed this tool and is going to give us a review of the tool and what it does, how it works, and then give us a little bit of information about Volusia County's, the sort of initial scoping exercise that we did when he introduced this tool at a workshop that we were at. And so he can use that as he goes through to demonstrate, how the tool can be used and exactly what the tool is. So I'm going to hand it over to Eben.
All right, thank
Hopefully
you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can
Yes.
you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. All right, well, thank you for having me today. I'm happy to be here and present to you a little bit about the tool and some of the results that came from some of the folks from Volusia County who provided some initial feedback on it. So just to kind of give you an overview of this, the code, we developed basically this code audit tool, and we've entitled it sort of Enabling Low Impact Development, Green Stormwater Infrastructure, a code audit tool for Florida counties and municipalities. Just to give you a high level view, there's certain unintended consequences, or maybe it was past wisdom about codes that, either explicitly or inadvertently restrict or prohibit some of the things that are done with low impact development and green stormwater infrastructure. The intent here is to take a view or do an objective assessment of a code and identify what maybe some of those barriers or intentional or unintentional obstructions or barriers might be. Just to give you sort of the structure here, we break the overall tool, which is this is a spreadsheet tool that is total has, I believe, about 120 to 140 questions. It's broken up into the categories that you see here, though, on the right. We have sort of an overview of the spreadsheet. I'll go into this a little bit more in detail in a moment. Just sort of some generic, definitions. So that's sort of understood. A log for what's being reviewed, contact information. And basically what we're doing is we're applying a scoring to each question to evaluate how well a code either supports or limits the implementation of LID and GSI. And so each of these categories, we break this up into about 16 different categories. We have some sections here on local government planning and policy that reviews the sections of comprehensive plan and zoning. Then we have some aspects of protecting nature. So natural resources, coastal areas, trees, sensitive groundwater areas. Stormwater and water quality is its own subsection, and then built environment. And so within each of these sort of sections here, these four major categories, we have a list of questions that are scored from 0 to 4, with a 0 being basically that it essentially prohibits something that would be beneficial to implementing LID or GSI. And a 4 would be something, basically the maximum possible implementation through code through a requirement of some type. That's sort of a high level overview. So before you go into the audit, there is sort of a pre-audit phase, okay, where you lay the groundwork. And this is designed to either be used by a local public works group or be done by an external entity. Typically, we suggest that you set up a core team of 3 to 4 that are going to kind of spearhead this. And there's two parts here. basically the scoping exercise, which I'm going to kind of go into sort of some of the results from some of the responses we got. And then there's the code audit. The community scoping exercise is sort of a high level first assessment of the community and kind of thinking about sort of a lot of the extraneous aspects of changing and updating code. So it kind of looks at, you know, if GSI or LID has been implemented in the community, what kind of acceptance there is for GSI, what are the priorities of the community, and then limiting it down to, okay, which specific code sections would we prioritize for doing the audit and maybe then updating. So this community scoping exercise, it's guided questions for this core group and liaisons. Liaisons are, you know, between the core group and the different departments within the public works or the local government. We're really looking at sort of these main high level questions. How does stormwater or water quality affect your community? What natural assets function as stormwater infrastructure? What LID and GSI is currently in your community? How accepting is your community of this? What about the elected officials? And then who would be allies and who would be opponents? Because some folks are going to be, you know, they're going to be for this no matter what. There's going to be people who are going to be opposed to change, and just kind of understanding the lay of the land in that high level. But the goal here is to identify strategies for auditing and updating the codes to enable, not necessarily to require, although you can, but to enable the implementation of GSI and LID. It's going to guide the user through sections of the code using what we call the CAST, the code audit spreadsheet tool. And really what we found and what others who have used similar tools have said is that some of the most important things that come from this is the discussion that happens amongst the municipal departments and organizations, because we can get so siloed amongst this. So there's 5 different sort of parts to the community scoping exercise. And this was completed during a workshop in the fall at the Marine Resources Council workshop. And I think we took maybe 2.5, 3 hours. There was a group who was from Volusia County who completed this tool as a team. And I'm going to be presenting some of those results here, sort of what came out of that. So the first part looks at evaluating what LID and GSI has been implemented in your community. Second part, community acceptance of LID and GSI. Third, natural infrastructure. Fourth, stormwater and water quality. And then 5, the potential for revising codes and policies. All right, so coming out of this, the results from part 1, what GSI, LID and GSI is a community. We see there's a wide range of different options here that are already examples of this within Volusia County. Everything from wetlands to cluster conservation subdivisions, bioretention areas, permeable pavement, BMATs. Right. Overall, the assessment was that the implementation is average, and that it is typically motivated by aesthetics, community benefits, water quality, stormwater volume or flooding, water conservation, and recreational education. There were some particular examples of successful projects. Demonstration at the Stetson Aquatic Center, nutrient reduction project with some verified water quality improvement, Victoria Park, planned unit development, Delphina Regional Library expansion, pervious pavement at that amphitheater. One of the aspects here is that maintenance for stormwater and GSI is complaint driven. So, community acceptance. Some of the highly rated benefits of LID and GSI were the ability to reduce flooding and pollutants, smaller infrastructure, improved infiltration, and groundwater recharge, and preserving natural areas and the aesthetics of the implementation. There seems to be some efforts to increase GSI in the community, but no outreach based on LID and GSI implementation or incentives for GSI currently. And the obstacles that discourage GSI were identified as water management district rules. Supporters of GSI tend to be a variety of organizations, including Stetson, VCARD, Soil Water Conservation District, several NGOs and environmental groups. And when we were asked to identify organizations or entities that are opposed, it was important that they noted that they weren't necessarily opposed, but they were skeptics, skeptical objections to GSI. And one thing that came out of this was that language can be jargony, so it's important to use clear everyday definitions in communicating LID and GSI. Some of the natural infrastructure that was identified as being valuable to implement LID and GSI to protect, or at least to try to find codes so that these valuable resources are maintained. Coastal shorelines, coastal resources, a lot of inland wetlands, springs, and aquifers. You've got a wide variety of natural resources that are valuable. Community recognizes the value that these provide as far as flood attenuation, water quality protection, regional cooling, wildlife habitat. So there's an understanding of a variety of natural resources and also a variety of benefits that these natural resources provide and the value that they need to be preserved. There are a few protective code designations already included for natural resource management areas, environmental core overlay, outstanding Florida waters, environmental future land uses and zoning categories, wildlife corridor, and so forth. It was noted that there were no requirements for stormwater treatment before infiltrating to groundwater or sinkholes or surface waters. So this is essentially looking at the aspect of just doing direct infiltration to the ground. We've seen that is not necessarily effective for removing nitrogen, particularly, and that can be an issue of contamination to the groundwater. Water bodies are protected by buffers 20 or 50 feet, should be a T there, but there's no vegetation or maintenance was reported. As far as stormwater and water quality goes, waters in this region were impaired for nutrients and dissolved oxygen, heavy metals, and chlorophyll A. That's sort of known just straight away, and multiple load reduction requirements that are TMDLs. And the community does have active projects to try to address stormwater, address septic to sewer conversions, and address treatment plant upgrades. Retrofitting and redevelopment with LID and GSI or traditional infrastructure may also help to alleviate flooding that is caused by older development that did not have the stormwater management infrastructure implemented when it was developed. And there were concerns about elevated groundwater and climate change that could also be addressed through retrofitting and implementation of LID and GSI. Some of the strategies that were noted were BAM, or biologically activated media. Septic tank improvements might address water quality problems caused by fertilizer. So these are strategies to address some of these pollutants. Looking at wastewater, non-point sources, and I'm not sure what this means, but apparently maybe you guys do, Jeff's cows as being a source of pollutants that maybe needs to be addressed. So as far as the stormwater code goes, initially the stormwater code was adopted in 1988, revised in 2003 and 2008. And then the stormwater code, their assessment does not include currently LID or GSI to address runoff from new or redevelopment projects. The community does have a stormwater master plan. Stormwater fee is currently ad valorem and generates funds for water quality and flooding projects. So looking at things like retrofits and implementation of baffle boxes, biologically active media, and so forth. We asked things about are there fee reductions for doing the on-site stormwater system, and there doesn't seem to be that kind of option in the system. Comp plan's peril of flood mitigation includes natural infrastructure, but the hazard mitigation plan does not really identify GSI as a mitigation option. So that's just seen as an opportunity there. And then when they were kind of considering the potential to revise codes and policy, so what are the incentives or sort of the groundwork basis for being able to revise these? The comprehensive plan does encourage LID and GSI. So their thought was that the code and the comp plan are in general average. So it's included in the comp plan, but it's not necessarily in the land development. And it's not a requirement. So it hasn't been, as I understand, it hasn't been directly implemented. The community attitudes, their perception of community attitudes on changing the code were mixed. They recognize that there is a contingent that wants more progressive policies and a contingent that wants fewer protections. Many people want change, but they don't know what they want. They just don't like what they have. Staffing and time restrictions were noted, and there was a vested interest in status quo are the biggest impediments to the community's codes. So the barriers that were noted to implementing this in code is that the LID is not specifically addressed, so it becomes more cumbersome. As far as moving now, kind of looking towards an audit, and I'll get into a little bit more of the details on what the tool looks like here in a moment. The priorities are the code sections that they thought could be improved to support LID and GSI. They identified zoning, site plan review, stormwater, street parking, erosion and sediment, and water quality. And the specific topics that seem to be what the community could improve most on were mostly on stormwater, but also in regard to site planning. All right, so this is sort of where we're at. You know, there's been an initial completion of the community scoping exercise, and this would then lead into a code audit being done on the codes. So the CAST is a fairly extensive, if you will, tool. It's meant to kind of cover a wide range of aspects where that can be directly or indirectly affected by stormwater. So the first step here would be to adapt the CAST and look at, is there an intent or need to do a full audit, or identifying those sections of the audit or individual topics, such as zoning, site plan, stormwater, street, parking, erosion, sediment, water quality. So these code sections, these might be the ones that are pulled out and prioritized and focused on those as a first step. Doing the audit is essentially a process of working through the questions, finding the codes and referencing those, recording the comments, and assigning a score for each question. The main thing is to really try and collect some input from the liaisons, particularly those who are working with the implementation of the code on a daily basis, who understand that part of the code, basically know it like the back of their hand. How can this, what are the opportunities here? How does this code actually maybe restrict or promote some of these things? You then want to basically calculate and compare the scores by these categories. So this would then give you an overall score for each section or each cumulative section of questions, to compare sort of relative potential scores and how well each section did. And then finally, identify the relative strengths and weaknesses of the sections and report the findings. So MuniCode, I think we're all probably in this section, or in this meeting familiar with MuniCode, but this is fairly easy to locate and identify codes for local governments on there. Getting more back into sort of what the CAST tool actually is. So as I mentioned, we have these 16 categories, and each of these categories has a section of questions or a list of questions. Some of them are fairly short. Some of them are maybe 8 questions, 4 questions. Some of them are more extensive, have more like 20 questions. Each question can be scored from 0 to 4. And again, 0 being the most prohibited or restricted to implementing these types of practices, 4 being a score that is most encouraging or maybe even required. So within each section, so this is the under this section topic, comprehensive plan and zoning, we would look at, for example, the total number of points that are accumulated for this section and divided by the total potential points. And this gives us sort of a percentage score. We do the same thing for each of these, and hopefully you can see that we would end up with different percentages here, that the total score out of the potential points. So for example, 16 here, the total maximum score is 4 per question. So there's 4 questions in this section. So maybe we only score a a 5 or a 7. And so we have a fairly low percentage, but in, under trees, we're doing really well, and we have a score of 22. This might tell us that at least determining between trees and sensitive groundwater, we don't need to necessarily focus on improving the tree ordinances. Our sensitive groundwater, the codes for protecting that is maybe not where it should be. So this is sort of an example of what one of these questions, a few of these questions might look like. So for example, this first question, do the goals, objectives, and policies of the future land use element of the comprehensive plan include protection of natural areas and open spaces? So within this, each question, we have included a tip that tries to put it into context why this is relevant to LID and GSI. So here they would have the protecting remaining natural areas inside urban service areas should be a stated priority, as well as preventing urban sprawl into rural areas. Code references here, this would be part of the documentation process of what is the basis for the score that's assigned. And then any additional interpretation, notes, ideas, or strategies could be captured here in several areas in the comprehensive plan referred to protecting natural areas, open space, so no further action is needed. So it's referred to, it's identified, so it's good, but it's not maybe great. Here we have, in this case, another question. Are sand dunes and other coastal terrestrial habitats protected from development code? We have some context here and the importance of this with respect to low impact development and GSI goals. We have some codes that's been referenced here, but in this case, although the code requires development to be a sufficient distance from the beach, the distance is not specified or required to be set by a qualified person. So these are some limitations and sort of a weakness in the code. Maybe this could be addressed, but this is sort of justification as for why we have sort of a code score 1 out of 4. So once the audit has been completed and you've kind of done all the questions, and it will automatically sort of tally and calculate things up. We propose or suggest that you follow some additional steps afterwards. Prioritize sort of the code amendments for the local needs. So what are the most pressing code updates that need to be addressed? Gather some of these applicable codes and ordinances, and then draft those for the body to adopt. I will note here that this tool currently, the way it stands now, is that it is a tool for identifying the gaps or the weaknesses. It is not a tool that gives you the solution to solving that. You could derive some suggestions for how you might do that from the scoring and some of the ways that you might interpret the questions. But we are currently actually working on a part 2 of this tool that would actually provide some suggestions or some examples of how codes have been developed in the state and addressing some of these issues. So that's in the works. So this tool kind of stops at here's where the gaps or the limitations might be. Beyond the codes, finding allies and promoting social acceptance. If you're trying to promote this, you can evaluate and address the financial concerns. How is this going to actually affect the operation of the county? Develop sort of the GSI capability. Some of the things that we understand from communities is that we don't necessarily have the technical expertise that understands how to design or review these. We don't know how to maintain these types of practices. Well, there are resources that are available. Just a plug, we developed a maintenance training course that we actually gave a few weeks ago at Stetson to some of the folks in the county to how to do maintenance on these types of practices, developing that capacity. And then the follow through here is implementing the code revisions, developing maybe a pilot or other early GSI projects, and then looking to monitor, evaluate, and update your progress. So with the next steps here from ours, I kind of mentioned what the limitations of this part is. We're working on a phase 2. That's kind of what's done here. We have done some pilot audits for Cocoa Beach in Alachua County, and we are in discussions with doing one for another county. Should start this summer. And that's sort of all that I wanted to cover here. This is a QR code. If you want to go ahead and download it, you You can take a picture of the QR code, or if you have the slides, you can click on this and it will take you to a page. We ask that people give us their email address just so if we update the tool, we can send it to them. But basically, it's just a page that'll take you to being able to download the tool if you'd like to look at it in more detail. I'm sure that somebody in staff can probably download it, or we can send it to you and distribute it if you'd like to take a closer look at it. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much for that. Sorry, I wasn't on my mic.
That's okay.
So just to sort of restate it in sleepy layperson's terms, we still need human beings to comb through the entire code, and in our case, we would be looking at chapter 72, comb through and find, just to use an example, we were kind of frustrated in talking about trees because we felt that there were implications for trees throughout the Code of Ordinances, and where were all these places and where we're going to have to go back and retweak certain things. So this requires knowledgeable human beings to comb through everything to kind of identify where the related topics reside and then score them and then address them. There's no AI in this. It's going to go through the whole the whole batch and do this work.
Well, I tell you, if I had incorporated AI into this, I would not be in this position. I would be working in a different role. No, it is not that level of automation at this point. It doesn't, do natural language digestion, but what it is, I would say, is a guide for how to approach and begin this process, rather than just saying, okay, here's the codes, have at it and enjoy your updates. I think that it does provide a map to how to navigate through your codes, looking at specific questions, looking at important, relevant questions, and there are certain folks who are in your organizations that know this code and work with it on a daily basis. Those people are the best ones for those particular questions for when you're trying to evaluate these types of codes. I wouldn't recommend necessarily someone just embarking on this without any real experience in the code on their own. I think you have to, that the value here is that you really have to utilize the folks who are familiar with the code, using it on a daily basis, implementing it on a daily basis, and getting their knowledge on these different topics as well. They need to be engaged in that process.
Thank you. I wanted to make clear, my question didn't imply a criticism, because I see this as evaluation, diagnostic, and I guess eventually prescriptive, which is great.
I feel like this is a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Because I don't see it as a product from this grant. So are you guys going to do this? Or are you thinking we're doing this? Like, is this coming? What? I'm unclear when it actually happens.
It's not, no, we weren't looking at you doing it. We were looking at whether or not you recommended that staff work through this process, or that we find funding in a grant to have somebody who can actually oversee staff working through the process, so that there's somebody there to coordinate. Obviously, it's I think it would be good for Eben, based on the process he's been through with the other counties, to just kind of give you an idea of how long it's taken folks to work through this, so you can get an idea of staff time, and then also any associated costs with doing this. That would be interesting too. So just to get an idea of the staff investment that's required, Eben, would be great.
Sure, and it's all going to be proportional to the size of the the organization size of the codes and how extensive the audit would be. Alachua County is probably a comparable comparison there. And I think that that one was, we did a fairly extensive audit of their codes. And I think that that was somewhere on the lines of 4 to 6 months of, and not the staff doing it, but only a few folks kind of working as an external organization, trying to coordinate a few meetings with them to glean their knowledge to implement this. It's so, for example, here's another example. There's another county that we are looking at doing an audit with, and we've actually partnered with the Urban and Regional Planning Program here at UF, whose graduate students are required to do an internship. And one of the options we're going to provide them to do is, particularly if they are working in a local government, is to do an audit of their local government's codes. And we would basically fund their internship as part of this program. And so what that would look like is, for one student for about a semester is somewhere less than $10,000 for their support and sort of the administrative time to do that kind of an audit. So if you use, so it's kind of, it's all relative to how intensive the audit needs to be, and whether you do it internally or if you hire out an external organization to come in and do it for you. We could see this being where, consulting engineering firms might audit certain groups as well, or certain spouses.
Tyler, you have
go ahead. Sorry, I just wanted to say the reason you don't see this as a product of the grant work that's being done is because when we applied for this grant, this tool wasn't available. So, that Eben really kind of premiered it in the fall, and we applied for this grant sometime last year. So there's a little maybe cart before the horse, I don't know, but the tool wasn't available. And so now that it is, the discussion really is how do we best use it? Do we wait to make any recommendations to the council until after we, do the audit tool? So those are some of the discussions that we're at now kind of internally and think that it's appropriate to talk about here. We have recommendations coming from our grant team. Do we noodle on those, but hold them until after we do the audit tool, or, kind of, we have some options from how to go from here.
Before we embark on that really important discussion, if I heard you right, we had 2 questions. First, Tyler, and then Jessica.
Thank you. So I guess my question is, most of the barriers that I think of that I'm going to run into as challenges that I have as concerns aren't Volusia County code challenges. They're existing or proposed FDAP or St. John's River Water Management District challenge requirements. And some of them deal with existing presumptive criteria, as what it's called, for minimum treatment standards on sites. Some deal with existing best management practices, and I would challenge everybody to read the applicant's handbook, best management practices, just at least the list and the index, and understand everything that's there. So I bristle when I hear that this is all new techniques, because these techniques were written in the 80s before I was born. And so if it's existed since before I was born and it's brand new as an overall approach or technique, then it's confusing for me. So what I would look for is, has that been reviewed with the audit tool? And part B is, have a set of recommendations been developed for the state codes? And where the barriers of implementation of these ideas might be.
So that's a great question. And so I'm going to answer that in a little bit of, so the short answer is no, we haven't audited sort of the applicant's handbook or the state regs. And really, when you think about sort of LID and GSI, and I intentionally separate them partially because where they come into play in the development process. But it's specifically with LID, when we're looking at avoiding and minimizing the runoff that's generated from a development, a lot of that is controlled at the local level, or is guided or influenced by the local level codes and ordinances. The ERP program basically controls a lot of the GSI and how you design and manage the stormwater that is produced. So this tool is really aimed at sort of the front end and looking at ways that, you know, I joined late, but I heard a little bit of discussion on, you know, density and rather than minimum lot sizes, being able to do cluster development, what you can do with green space in parking lots, what are the minimum offsets or setbacks, things like that. So it really is, you know, if there are local ordinances that are specific to, for example, permeable surfaces, then this will address that. But really, a lot of the content that is in here or that is targeted or kind of in the purview here is beyond sort of the outside of the I would say the narrow focus of the ERP program with DEP and the water management districts.
So I would counter that we have to get an ERP permit for all of our projects and they deal with stormwater.
Sure.
So green stormwater infrastructure. Examples are that we would like to have small vegetated bioswales in people's backyards in a depressed area so that we can help to collect some nutrients into vegetation before it leaves somebody's yard. St. John's says that that can't be part of my nutrient removal treatment train unless I plat the tract separately because they've had performance issues with people filling it in their backyard. I imagine that it will create compliance challenges for us locally as well. So I'm not allowed to have stormwater infrastructure on site. To give you guys just a visual, a swimming pool, I have one in my backyard that's about 15,000 gallons. That's about 2,000 cubic feet of water. A typical house that has about a 2,500 square foot footprint, the garage is about 500 square feet. You've got some overhangs and some porches. It's about an 1,800 square foot house, generates about 2,700 cubic feet of runoff during our design storm events. So that runoff volume that we are going to be dealing with, that's the size of about a 40-foot shipping container. It is larger than most people's swimming pools in volume. So the reason that we have big ponds is to deal with our flood attenuation requirements of storing that water and not discharging it somewhere. And because, and to the credit of what LID is about, we are covering more area of land, so we're increasing that. But whether we take 100 acres and develop 20 acres of it with a high density and leave 80 alone, or not, I still have to have somewhere to put the water that gets increased in runoff from that 20 acres. We can't just sheet flow it onto the other 80 acres and it be called good under the DEP stormwater requirements, which are part of our flood insurance protection and everything else that gets calculated in. So I'm not asking this meaning it as an attack, but I see it as, you know, nutrient removal and flood protection are somewhat counter things. The more water I can get out to the ocean in advance of a big storm event, the more flood protection I can have with soil storage that's present in my sites. But the more I infiltrate into the soil, the more my canals are open, my lakes can be down in water level a little bit to accept that flood water. There's two different techniques. We're trying to blend them a little bit in our minds and they're somewhat in conflict. But I really think that there's a challenge in implementation in us using one technique and the state using the other, and all projects have to funnel through both permitting processes. My best solution is a big dry pit that I put water into. Just, you know, the reason I'm asking that question. And so how would you deal
I'm sorry,
with
was there a question there?
Yeah, so my question is, how do you deal with creating green stormwater infrastructure when it has to be external to the platted lots, but green stormwater infrastructure is about being at the source? So at the platted lot. How do we lay out the subdivision differently? How do I be less greedy in my design so that that's achieved?
Well, there's classes that are taught on that kind of subject. Let me get back to your question about the water management district and the state agency, just to kind of put this kind of to rest. The local government doesn't have the authority to change the rules of the state or the water management district. That was not in the scope of this tool. So it's only at the scope of what is adjustable and changeable at the local government level. So that is the point there. I mean, you're right about flood control. You're always going to have that flood control. However, taking advantage of the infiltration that can occur along the way, you think about, for example, let's use the, sort of a conceptual approach. Whenever you have rainfall that falls on a rooftop that goes to a driveway, that goes to a roadway, into stormwater pipes and into a pond, there's no opportunity for that water to infiltrate into the ground. So any space or storage is lost there. There's lots of different opportunities to install and utilize certain practices within the right-of-way that are off-lot that can be used to eliminate the water quality size storm event through various measures of either biologically activated media, infiltration of practices to reduce the actual generation of runoff rather than just using impervious surfaces. So there's a suite of tools that can be used to reduce that sort of volume. Yes, you're going to have to use some volume storage or some flood control there. But I would push back. I know some examples where they have used because it's separate from their water quality treatment. They've used, and downstream of it, you can use conservation area as part of your flood control. I could send you some examples of that.
I know Victoria Park, the northeast quadrant, they use the wetlands impounded as part of their flood control. Typically, we don't get great depressions on our site. They're pretty flat or they're on a hill. And so if I have woods that, unless I go build a 3-foot berm around it, are not going to hold the water, it's hard for me to use as part of the attenuation control. I have a site that is in permitting right now, City of DeLand. It's 12 houses, 5 acres. I meet none of the LID avoidance component of this criteria, but I meet all the green stormwater infrastructure. I have no directly connected impervious surfaces with my pond. It's a purely dry retention pond. We have no discharge during design storm events, all of that stuff. So it's something that we do practice as engineers where we can. But that was a 9,500 square foot lot minimum subdivision. I put inlets on every lot line. The stormwater's costing about $80,000 more to build, but it's what the developer wanted. So there are these projects that are happening. I can give you an example of one that'll be built this year in our town, but it's not. I had to use a dry pond. I didn't use plantings or other things to achieve this because of our stormwater code at a state level that I'm having to meet. So it's not that I disagree with the disconnection of impervious, it's that I got no credit for that. I also can't I would have loved to take those inlets that are in the lot lines and set them 6 inches above the bottom of my swale grade. So the swale holds 6 inches of water every time it rains before it starts going into my pond. But if I do that, then I have to take that whole side yard and make it a separate tract and call it stormwater. And so that's one of my barriers, and that's not a local barrier, that is a state barrier. So the reason that I'm asking the question of has this been evaluated for barriers at the state level is if we're making recommendations for implementation at the local level, I think that it would be valuable for us to know that they're going to be available options within the state rules as well.
So to make a suggestion, just to keep this moving along, our task is to look at our local ordinances. I appreciate what you're saying about conflicts, but our task is to say these are things that we believe would be a good idea and right for Volusia County present and future residents. And some of those won't encounter issues and some of them may, correct? And so why don't we move forward being mindful of where there may be other restrictions that we need to take into consideration, or perhaps we'll receive guidance from staff on these things, rather than not talk about the work that we're supposed to do. Let's move forward, I would suggest, and then address the exceptions. I guess that's what I'm saying. Let's get as much done as we can get done and then address the exceptions.
My concern is that the exceptions haven't been identified. And I don't want to be the responsible party for identifying the potential conflicts or exceptions. And so I think that if we are going to evaluate recommendations for changes to our code to implement new techniques while other codes are being changed, the compatibility should be a component of the review, not
And
necessarily tasked of our committee, but before it comes
Right.
to our committee.
But this will always be somewhat of a moving target, and particularly at the legislative session that's just drawing to a close has made many changes that will affect our lives and affect what we do locally. There is stormwater rulemaking going on right now. So I think
They have suggestions that are incompatible with existing state code. I have trouble with us evaluating suggestions to alter our code when the suggestions haven't been evaluated for compatibility with the state law that we have to follow. That's going to be my position on this. Moving forward, if the group wants to move forward, I will be a passenger on the bus. But I think that we're just wasting our time to evaluate something that hasn't been properly vetted for implementation as an implementation evaluation, which is what I think we're here to do.
So if I could speak to that,
Can we get a
Eric Living-
consensus on that principle that has just been proposed here?
yes, we can, but I would like to hear what Dr. Bean and what Ginger were going to say.
So we had this tool reviewed by Eric Livingston, who has, he's basically been running state stormwater and been developing manuals all over the state for years. So this is a tool that has been, no, we haven't gone through every single thing here, but it's not meant to, it actually doesn't suggest anything. It really is just for you to evaluate and to identify what your code does with respect to different practices. So I feel like we have done a fairly diligent job of trying to get that evaluated for the objective that it's designed to be.
I was just going to say too, so we have two things going on, right? We have Eben and he's talking about the tool, and that's one thing. And I think Tyler, when you were talking about recommendations, that's more of the regional planning council team that is developing, some guidelines or some recommendations for us. So I didn't take what you said as you didn't like the tool necessarily, but
I don't think we're ready to be discussing the implementation of policy changes based on an evaluation that comes out of the tool until we've evaluated our code and also looked at how the compatibility with the state code is, because I think it's got a great barrier identification component to the tool that is going to light up, especially when we compare the two separate sections.
But I did want to just make the distinction that Eben had said earlier, is that there are the two things. There's the low impact development that is mostly about the local code, how you design your site. And then there's the green stormwater infrastructure, which is where you get into the compatibility with ERP permitting or whatever. So as we're thinking about that, there are things we have more control over and things we have less control over. So just kind of keep that in your mind.
An unrelated quick question, although I do think we should circle back and talk about that as an overall. If we have organizations that we're associated with who want to do some homework and use this tool, is it just open? Can we just use that QR code and go through the county code or municipal code with that as a guide?
Yeah. Yes, it's freely available. We've just, be honest, my administration likes to know how many people use our tools. And this is, one way of kind of doing just a counter. If we get an email address, it gives us an estimate to be able to give to the bean counters, to be perfectly honest. So
Perfect.
And I think you can bypass the email request anyway, but yeah, it's freely available.
was just gonna add, I mean, I've heard Tyler make these kinds of arguments before, and I think that the point about compatibility is really about getting credit, right? Like if you're gonna go these other directions, you want the state agencies to give credit for it. So these kinds of tools are cost effective, possibly even cost saving. And, you know, and that's fair. That's certainly a fair perspective. I think what we have an opportunity to do here, though, is actually establish higher standards than the state requires. Is uncomfortable sitting across the table from, you know, people, you know, who don't want to have to spend more to do the right thing. But I think this is what we're talking about here is, can we as a county have additional requirements above and beyond the minimum standards of the state that protect our resources and our people? So, I mean, that isn't incompatible. It's just higher standards. And yeah, it would be nice if the state would raise those standards too, or adjust the standards so that credit is given for, you know, for different management practices. So, and I guess I would also add, you know, we had talked earlier in the season about having a small group of people who might break out as a subcommittee to do some additional work, whether that was big umbrella work or down in the weeds work. And, you know, maybe now is the time where we need to set up a subcommittee to really work more closely with staff to do this audit tool. So we're not having to wait once a month to, you know, to do what we did with trees, which has spent 6 months doing the, you know, the Byzantine wordsmithing. So I would propose that too.
To that last point about not wasting time, we also had a learning. Sorry, I'll come back. You pushed him up. We also did learn that it was more effective for us to have a brief presentation of the ordinance that we're going to discuss by staff rather than us trying to decipher it. That's an aside. So there's a shelf life to this committee. There's a requirement that we do look at everything and make the changes. And if I heard correctly, the audit tool, the use of the audit tool, it takes some 4 to 6 months. Was that right? 4 to 6?
Yeah, I mean, it
Kinda,
depends on
sorta?
the amount. Yeah, I mean, it
Yeah.
depends on the amount of time and number of people you kind of dedicate to it. So yeah, I think it could be as short as maybe a month and a half if you had multiple people really just focused on this almost full time for a large code.
And when you pointed out certain areas to focus on, were those specific to Volusia County or were those general?
Yes, those were essentially what had come from the community scoping exercise completed by Volusia County.
So that could sort of.
Yeah, it could. The only thing I would caution about that scoping exercise was it had, you know, we did that at this low impact development workshop with the people that from Volusia County that showed up, right? It wasn't any kind of scientific, like, hey, we got all the right people at the table or anything. It was just who was at that meeting. So, I mean, I think we did a fairly good job. I mean, Wendy was there. Some of our stormwater folks were there. So, but it wasn't necessarily like, hey, we're going to actually intentionally do this tool and who are the right people to, like, for instance, Clay wasn't there. We, you know, so.
Throw me under the bus, don't you?
I mean, so, no, I don't mean that Clay was negligent in not being there. I mean that if you were going to really do it, do that scoping tool, there were probably people that weren't at the table that should have been, right?
I saw a lot of that on social media, but what I'm getting to is we can't wait for I don't think we can wait for an entire audit to be conducted to proceed with our work. We might need to decide where we would get bang for buck if we're going to use that. And then Bob asked that we make a decision about whether we want to keep moving forward, even though there will be conflicts with regulatory authorities beyond Volusia County. Did I get that right? Yeah. So, Mr. Urban.
Thank you. Even though I wasn't in attendance.
Yeah. The,
I do want to point out that currently we do have in Volusia County, the city of Ormond Beach does have its existing standards. Those are not mandated, but they are things that are optional and available to the development community to utilize. So therefore, that indicates to me that they've had some sort of vetting. I understand we don't want to go through this exercise to create something that is not implementable. At the same point in time, you can get into analysis paralysis if you're trying to create that perfect mousetrap. So I would recommend that we continue on with this process. One, because we got a real grant that's doing a lot of legwork for us that is helping out. Second of all, we can continue going through this vetting effort through the ENRAC and ultimately through our Planning and Land Development Regulation Commission and our county council. If the concern is that it's not going to be utilized by St. John's or DEP, which ironically, you go to their websites, they're big supporters of LID and GSI. So the thing about it is, I agree with Tyler. There are some aspects of it where St. John's and DEP are proponents of LID and GSI, but they're not necessarily giving the credits, as Wendy referenced, to developers. So therefore, there's this default mode that I know I can do X, Y, and Z and get my job done, as opposed to fighting 9 months, a year with St. John's to get with this other project. Let's keep that in mind. And so we can still proceed forward. We can still come up with good, sound recommendations. And then at that same point, as Ginger referenced, and Katrina referenced, we can be looking through as to how to, what I say, ground truth, what we're doing with our state agencies. Just throwing that out there.
Let me give an example of the conflict that I'm talking about in my mind. And I think, Wendy, you hit it exactly right. It's that we're not getting credit. So on my project, if I could have popped my inlets and those swales up 6 inches or 9 inches and held water in all those swales, I would have had a lot less water to get in my pond, and my pond would have actually been smaller, which is really what they're talking about, is that we can spread out our stormwater infrastructure throughout the site and not have these giant holes in the ground. But because St. John's and the DEP, I mean, I don't even have to go to St. John's, I can self-certify the site, which thank God. But because the state requirements from DEP don't allow me to have the commingling because of the challenges that I have in their practice and application of rule, I have to meet both. So I have to have the big pond, and then if I had to have green stormwater infrastructure for Volusia County, I would have to have that too, but I wouldn't get the smaller pond that it's intended to get. So our water quality would get helped, our flood attenuation would get helped, but we'd have a double stack of standards that make things cost a lot more and get more than what we really need to get in that sense. And that get more takes land up. It's not just eliminating a land area. So it's not just the credit of, we're not getting money for doing this other stuff. It's if we have to do both, we've really increased our costs versus one or the other.
So I can't articulate the regulatory conflicts as well as Tyler, but I do want to address the cost side of this thing. I take that back. Many people think that the cost is borne by the developer. And I'm here to tell you that my margin has been the same for about 30 years. And as a matter of fact, in this current marketplace, I'm fighting because I've lost about 3 points of the industry accepted and average return. The bottom line here is that every penny we add through regulation goes directly to the homeowner. It's the reason that the average family in Volusia County today cannot afford the average house. We have an affordability problem that gets worse and worse. Just a short statement on how bad it is. Habitat for Humanity is in the top 25 builders in the nation. Now, What that says is we've got a serious problem if a nonprofit like Habitat, which I've always supported because it's my industry and this is an important aspect of my industry, they've become one of the top 25 builders in the nation. That's because we continue to write regulations and do things that create additional expense. I can't stay in business if I don't keep my margin. And every penny that's added through regulation and fees goes right to the homeowner. So please keep that in mind as we do anything.
Having worked for almost 40 years in for-profit industries, profit margin is something that I personally pay attention to. Correct. Correct, but I don't think here we're going to litigate the types of homes that are being built and how that meets an affordable housing need, although we might like to. I do get your point about things cost money.
I'm not going down the affordable route. What I'm trying to make really forefront in everyone's mind is that everything we do gets passed on to the ultimate consumer. It doesn't get paid for by the developer.
So again, at the time that this committee was constituted, there was a request from the county council to examine LID. Am I remembering correctly? And we were all appointed to look through the code of ordinances, knowing that there will be conflicts. We would hope to harmonize those conflicts where we may, and where we can't harmonize them, then we have to call them out. And we are a multifaceted committee precisely to bring forward issues like affordability and issues that are environmental. And it's our job to somehow come to some type of consensus in order to recommend to the Planning and Land Development Regulatory Commission and eventually to the county council what our best assessment is. And there's room to talk about, in my mind anyway, to talk about the implications from a cost structure. I would even envision seeing our lobbyists talking about where there are conflicts that disincentivize the type of development that this group of citizens might decide we would like to see. So I want you to know you are heard and will continue to be heard, but we also have a job to do in a certain amount of time. And I'm concerned that we get something done. That's what I'm trying to drive for now, not to drive for an actual solution, but do we keep moving forward or do we go to the county council and say, we're stuck? Jessica and then Wendy.
Yeah, I would say that I think we're making a lot of good topics, but I think we are in the trees when we're supposed to be looking at the forest, I think today. And that this reminds me of our first meeting on trees where we spent 3 hours talking generally about positions and we didn't get through any language. And we're still on trees. We're going to go back to trees after this. Right, we're not done with trees. We'll go back there. And so I would just caution that I think that the discussion is good. We always have good discussion. I really like this group because of it. But I agree with Wendy. It might be time to put together, a task like we did for trees. Everyone was supposed to provide their comments and we wanted to go through those. I think with the grant, we're at a position where this has kind of been our introduction on LID, the debrief, kind of the intro to the topic. The grant writers are going to work on draft ordinances. We have time because our next meeting is not going to be on LID code review. It's going to be back on trees and then it's going to be on other topics we've slated. If we want to pull together a small group to go through the audit tool, or if we want to ask some organizations we're involved in to take a look and provide recommendations, I think we have time there to have, real world discussions on how this provision impacts cost, how this provision conflicts with state law. Because I think we can get caught up in rhetoric, but we have to have a product. So,
Wendy?
I hear you. And I too am a business owner and I understand margins. So I get it. And I certainly get the point about affordable housing. I would also like to add, and I'm going to jump back to Tyler's remarks too, this idea that we might be doing excessive design, by stacking the lot scale stormwater mitigation on top of the community scale. I think that when we start seeing the size of storms that are going to become more and more common, we need this extra infrastructure. We are going to need this extra storm mitigation. We need to be out in front of the state regulations that are probably still lagging behind by about 10 years, the reality on the ground of what our weather and our climate is doing. So I would say that, and from an affordable housing perspective, making sure that our homeowners can also afford the insurance that they're going to need, the National Flood Insurance Program and the subsidized costs for private flood insurance. If those homes don't flood because they have extra stormwater mitigation baked into the lot design or the community's design, that's got to be a benefit to them at the end of the day. Maybe they pay a little bit more in their mortgage, but they're going to get, perhaps the insurance companies will give them a discount because they don't flood, or maybe they can't afford flood insurance, but the fact that they don't flood means they don't lose their homes in a big storm, which is, not irrelevant. So I'll just leave it at that.
Would someone like to move? I don't know if it requires a motion. Would someone like to move to create a committee to work on stormwater separately and come back? Jessica, would you like to?
I was gonna say, I know Chris had to leave. He hates committees and no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
He doesn't hate committees. He's hesitant about them. I wanted to see from a staff perspective, is it helpful to do that? Can we meet with staff and go through? Are we not there yet? Is it better to just table this for a little bit until we've got some draft recommendations and maybe we've gotten some organization input? What's the feeling? Because I feel like we might not touch on this for another 4 months.
Well, I need to throw this out. I won't be here at the next scheduled meeting, and Clay won't either. So we might talk about canceling the next meeting. I mean, it's up to you guys, or scheduling it for a different day, but we're both at different conferences that week. So not sure what we, what we were going to talk about. Well, right. If we're going to talk about LID, Katrina is the expert on staff, so that's fine. But if we were going to go back to trees, or we were going to tackle something different, then, my preference is that I would be here for that. So to the LID thing, I think we learned some lessons on trees. I don't think it's too early for this group to say, we think that the practice of low impact development and green stormwater infrastructure is important, and we think our county should do it, or not. And we think that incentives, these kinds of incentives are great. We think that in some cases things should be required. I don't think it's too early to say those sorts of general things. You don't have to know where in the code we would change in order to say those things. If you said, we love LID and but we want to incentivize it first, that's direction. We can still go through and do the audit tool over the course of how long it takes and identify where things need to be changed. Alternatively, we can do the tool first and we'll be back, in whatever, 6 months and talk about LID again. I don't know that that's, well, I don't know. I don't want to presume what the council is going to do. The other thing that I wanted to throw out there is council is having a goal setting workshop on May 10th. It is from 3 to 7 p.m. It's you can watch it online. It's in the council chamber. So, but it's a workshop. So, they won't be actually making decisions, but they're going to all lay out what their priorities are. And I think that some of what's discussed, it will be relevant for this group and the work that we're doing. So a lot of moving parts. So the staff is here at your pleasure. We can move in whatever direction you want. I think that from a concept level, we've got plenty of information to talk about low impact development. We won't have the final product of the grant team by the next meeting. So if you would prefer to have that first, then I would say we're looking at July. And so then we could go back and talk about trees next time, or we could, either skip or reschedule the June meeting at your pleasure.
To answer Jessica's question, because I don't think we got to the point of whether or not do we like seeing a subcommittee come out of this.
Sorry.
I just have to be very blunt. The fact is if you have a subcommittee and they work 2 months and they come forward and then we basically go line by line with the major group. We've just extended the time frame out even further. And I just want to make sure it's not being said as an offense, but just the reality is that the level of scrutiny that this committee wants to provide as a whole body needs to be clarified to the staff. If y'all want to drill down and get into the weeds of what is being proposed as part of the changes to the comprehensive plan and the land development regulations, we can do that. It's going to be an arduous grind, and if we are looking for that level of detail, I would recommend just bringing it to the full body, because otherwise we're still going to be chasing around more and more comments. And again, there is a larger issue, and I just want to kind of say this, is that if you review what this University of Florida and East Central Florida Regional Planning Council brings back to us, and at the face value, you agree with everything they're saying is going to be done, but understanding that there may be implementation problems, it's still okay to send it on to the county council with those concerns. Then the county council gets to earn their income by making that decision at that point in time as to what is going to be the policy. And one of the things that we can do, again, once we've got the blessings from this group, we are not in a silo. We can work with our colleagues at St. John's and at DEP saying, this is coming to our council. What are you going to say to a developer who comes in here with this and implements it? Are you going to ding their plans because it doesn't have sufficient capacity in the ponds, and that you're not certain that the attenuation program is this, and your CN level is not correct, or the other things that we have to go through in the microcosm of going through the pain of a stormwater plan? That to me gives us what I believe the county council directed us and this group to do when they approved the grant originally. So again, that's just kind of doing the 10,000 foot level and hopefully providing some clarity.
So just follow-up question. I think that's in line with what I was thinking, that even if we do a subcommittee, it's going to be just as long as we bring it back. When we first met, we talked about how LID is going to be a big thing that we discuss, one of the key items that we look at. And I think when we talked about scheduling, we said we'd start with trees because it's easy. I know that's but we structured it so that LID would be after review of the stormwater element, because that was recently updated. We'd get that background and we could review them together. I think we shifted the schedule because we had the opportunity to hear from the speakers and to get feedback on the grant. But my suggestion may be it may be a good idea to wait to come back for that full review, at least until we get through that stormwater, because they're very tied together.
So I'm looking this way.
It's the purpose. Is this something that you're asking us to recommend we do? Or is this something that you're planning on doing and want feedback from the committee? I'm lost on the purpose of it.
Okay, so to go back to why the ENRAC committee was reestablished, which was to advise the staff and the council on recommended changes to our environmental minimum standards and our land development code. The reason low impact development was on the list of things to look at is because there have been members of the council who have wanted to implement LID in our community for water quality protection and for flood protection, and all the reasons that we've heard why this is an important topic. So, our expectation, or from the staff perspective, the expectation is that the council convened this group of people from diverse backgrounds to say, hey, what does the community want? What do you, as representatives of these council members, suggest that we go to the council at some point with a presentation? It doesn't have to be ordinance language. The presentation is, we've looked at low impact development, and here are our recommendations for whatever bits and pieces we think we should implement here in Volusia County. That's sort of how I envision it. And then the council makes a policy direction then we kind of create some language after that. That's typically how we, like if it's a staff driven thing, that's normally how it goes. We get direction from council, then we work on ordinance language. So
Okay, and so this is an attempt to dig into the ordinance language so that we can evaluate the ordinance. So
yeah, because what we've heard so we've been discussing low impact development at the staff level for at least 5 years, trying to do education. And what we hear often is we can't do it. There are too many barriers. We can't do it in Volusia County or in a lot of places. And so this tool is one of the ways that we can at least identify those barriers. So we can answer those questions. Are the barriers insurmountable, or are there things in our code that we can change? Right. And to Tyler's point, we don't get to change, the other people's codes, but so that's just part of the process is, in concept, is this something that we want to do? And that, of course, is the council's ultimate direction, but they're looking to you for guidance. And then if it is something we want to do, what are the barriers, and are those barriers things that we can, through our own work, make changes to?
So, and I'm not trying to be complicated by any means. So we've had the presentation and we've had all this great discussion about it. Are you looking for a recommendation from us about this study or this toolkit?
Well, ultimately, we're looking for a recommendation to take to council about low impact development as a concept and if
I get that, but this presentation specifically.
So yeah, we're looking for feedback about whether you think you can make a recommendation as a group without doing this tool, or is your feedback that we have to do this in order to move forward? We just wanted to present this as one of the options that we can
That
do.
makes sense. Thank you.
So if I understand, we will wait for them to make recommendations on the code changes for LID, but this audit tool is kind of something that's still too new. Just wanted to tell us it was there, but let's wait and get some recommendations back, and then we can review what the recommendations are, right? And that won't happen next month, but it will happen the month after that, right? Sure, I'd like to see the recommendations.
May I
Go ahead.
interject? And then Sarah Lee. I feel guilty for the audit tool. I thought it would be something that we could use immediately to help us find within the Code of Ordinances where there were related topics so that we could be more effective and efficient. And right now, we're looking at it as a separate add-on from, do we like LID enough to move forward with LID? And keep looking at that. And I'm kind of looking at LID as separate from the original task of the ENRAC, which is to go through the environmental regulations and the development codes, which, as you had said at one point, Ginger, needed updating. Some of them hadn't been updated for 30 years. Those codes, we embarked upon a process that seems to work better, where instead of us reading the redlined version of the tree ordinance, staff comes to us and said, we're recommending these changes generally because this is what we have and it's not working that well for us anymore. This is what we need to have. And then it made it easier for us to focus in. That's with everything other than LID. Then LID, two-part. Are we, with this overview, sufficiently interested in it to say, yes, let's see what comes back, and then we can go to council and be very specific, or we can go to council and be very general. Did I get that right? Because we're not going to be writing those. Yeah. So that's another thing. Then the audit tool is a third thing, and the June meeting cancel or change date is the fourth thing that we have to decide on in the next 5 minutes. So are we good with everything but LID, with staff presenting to us why they're recommending certain changes so that we can accelerate that portion of our work? Does that make any sense? Sarah Lee?
I think we got off track. Okay. With the audit tool.
Yeah.
And I think we need to go back to Mr. Murphy when he was sitting here, because he made some very specific questions to this group that would, in my mind, based on the presentation and the material that we've reviewed previously, influence some of the recommendations that they may make to the county staff and the council in their final product. For instance, where, there is a yes or no theoretically to LID, but you can dig deeper. And one of the comments that he made was, okay, maybe you think LID is only good in certain areas, green development, as opposed to the super developed urban areas. Do we want to influence the recommendation to be in undeveloped green areas? Are we talking about residential? Are we talking about non-residential? That was another subject area. Are we talking about incentivizing LID or making it mandatory? I mean, there's discussion in today's presentation and the materials that I think, I'm sorry, it's already 4 o'clock, but I think we could have answered those questions today. Maybe not consensus, everyone's in agreement, but I think enough discussion on those questions that would have possibly influenced some of the thoughts. I think the conversation about the Water Management District and DEP is essential and cannot be ignored to moving forward with LID, regardless of where you want LID. It cannot be ignored. What seems obvious to me from listening is that, and I'm sorry, if Ormond has had LID since 2013, and they've incentivized it by waiving the conceptual site plan review fee, it doesn't work. Okay. So incentivizing it has either got to be hugely significant, like major density bonuses, or, changing lot coverage percentages. I mean, it's got to be pretty significant, or it's not going to work. You're not going to see it. And one good reason why you're not going to see it is because there's conflicts across the state in the permitting process. And that's not easy to get through. And you're not going to throw away an extra 20% of your site if you don't have to. So, and that was in one of the YouTube videos, which I thought the one I'm thinking about was very good, because it was a very good panel, very diverse panel, developers and otherwise. And they came right out and said, it's not going to work if you incentivize it. You got to make us do it. And it costs more money. And that is an issue, particularly if we're only going to look at residential. We do need to think a little bit about the implications. So I don't know what you guys want to do. It's 4 o'clock. I feel like we could have given some direction.
So I'd like to make a motion that we get the recommendations from the grant and review them either next time or the time after that. Right? Isn't that what we're here for?
Discussion?
I want to add to what Sarah Lee was talking about with the incentives that we have today are kind of crap. I mean, no offense, but our application fees everywhere are less than $5,000. The impact fee on every house is over $20,000. My 12 lot subdivision, it's a $60,000 or so increase in the stormwater system. Divide that by 12, it's $5,000 a house. There is no incentive that exists today within the system that we're looking at that is $5,000 a house. But in the perspective of things, maybe we should be looking at ways to generate that, or maybe it's a penalty for not. But I think a mandatory with no bypass to it is going to box us into unintended consequences
We
that
said
are
waiver.
creators.
We didn't
Well,
say there would be. a
Well,
waiver.
and so that's where, when I say incentivize, I'm not picturing a waiver of an application fee where I lose 2 months on the front end of a project. If I recommend that to my client and it doesn't go perfectly, I don't have that client anymore. So I ignore that. But if I could save them 100 grand on the back end, that's a conversation they'll entertain. And that's where, as a panel, we have to decide of, the impact fees are there as a concurrency to cover the impact of the development. But I think within this motion, we should still be looking at ways to incentivize and not just mandatory. That's my only thought.
If I can add to the discussion, and I'm going to do it quickly because I had a 4 o'clock call. If we can think about with the current motion, coming back, if we do keep the June meeting, which is going to be my recommendation, to focus on answering those questions that Sarah Lee raised, because I think that'll take long enough. And if it's a short meeting, I wouldn't mind. Focusing on that, the big picture, because I think part of the questions is I have not heard, and this is from the development community side, anyone say we don't want low impact development. So I think we're there. I think it's how do we implement it? And so with that as the guiding principle, I think that we could meet with Katrina next time, go through big picture questions from this presentation, provide some additional guidance as the grant wraps up their recommendations, and kind of knock that out and keep our June meeting.
Are we amending the motion? Do I have to what? What is it, Chris?
The original person has to amend the motion
Okay.
and then get a new second, right?
I'll amend the motion to include reviewing the LID big picture next time, keeping our meeting.
Do we have a second? Discussion? Any discussion? All those in favor? Oh, Alex, I'm sorry, you have your thing. I'm sorry.
The only thing that I have to throw in order for Volusia County to obtain the flood insurance and resilience benefit of this LID ordinance or what have you, what we're working on here, it has to be required from the CRS program. So with that being said, incentives are nice, but that requirement language has to be there at least in some form of baseline to obtain the flood insurance discount or to obtain the points for the flood insurance discount rating. So,
Thank you. So that's definitely something to bear in mind next time.
Another discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Let's vote. All those in favor?
I have one.
Oh,
I have one-
Corky, I'm sorry. I'm looking, I didn't sleep last night, so
One
I'm
more,
looking for
just a
hands.
discussion point is only that part of this needs to be that we discuss it at the next meeting and that both Mr. Irvin and Ginger are there. They need to be here at a next meeting. I know. So we need to change that meeting. And I want to make that point of the discussion relative to the
Okay, does everybody understand right now? The question before us was to work on the big picture items at our next meeting. Corky has added to the discussion about whether we change that date to make it possible for Ginger and Clay to be available to us in the meeting.
Right.
And what date would that be?
Well, I could send out an email to everybody asking for dates. I don't,
Could we ask Clay and Ginger if they would be comfortable having the meeting as originally scheduled with Katrina running it? Just so that as we consider this discussion on meeting date?
I think Katrina's got a better understanding of what we're trying to get through. She will be able to get through the technical aspects when you start talking about the policy directions, implementations. Ginger and I can address that if you'd like.
That sounds
Okay. Okay, Katrina, all those,
yeah, you got Keith.
yeah.
All we need is eight.
All right, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. So big picture next meeting, date as planned. John?
Yeah, yeah.
I told you all I'm not good on Robert's rules. Are we legal? Are we legal? Okay, next meeting, regular date and time. Discuss the big pictures. Katrina will be our Sherpa, and have a great month.
Pictures we had. It's pretty awesome. So
I do when I let books out.
Good God, you talk too much.
I will, yeah. There has to be a set, yeah.